If Ukraine does not survive, the United Nations will not survive. Have no illusions.
Hello, everyone, and I'm happy to welcome you at our next third installment in our lecture series, Wartime Lectures, in which we reflect on the war in Ukraine and everything that's happened after the full-scale invasion of Russia into Ukraine on the February 24th. Today, this lecture series is organized by School for Policy Analysis and Kyiv-Mohyla Alumni Association and by the University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy in partnership with Justus Liebig University at Gießen and the Center for East European Studies at Gießen University. And we are very happy to have Pol Danьєrі today, who is a professor of political science and public policy. We are also happy to have my colleague who will be comment today, and that is Maxim Yakovlev, who is the director of School for Policy Analysis and head of the Department of International Relations at Kyiv-Mohyla Academy at our home university, let's say. And today I will moderate the session, and I'm a research director of School for Policy Analysis. So, Paul, I'm very happy to welcome you, and I'm giving the floor to you today, please.
Thanks very much, Anna, and thanks for organizing this, and thank you, Maxim, as well for your role. If we could start with the slides, that would be great. Okay. So what I want to talk about today is the causes of the war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the implications for a potential peace agreement. And I want to link these two things together, which is not the only way to think about a peace agreement. But on the slide there, you can see that that's the cover of the book that I published in 2019, which really tried to explain how Ukraine and Russia got from the so-called civilized divorce of the early 1990s to the point in 2014 where Russia had invaded Ukraine. And I'm now working on a revised version of that book to go up through the invasion of 2022. And in writing this new version of the book and writing the conclusion in particular, I'm constantly thinking about two things. One of them is, how does this end? And in particular, how do we get back to peace in Europe, not just a fragile ceasefire, but real peace? And what are the causes? How do we explain this? How do I explain this in particular to American readers who might not know a lot about the situation? So those two things then have been on my mind, and I think they fit together. Although I would stress that in thinking about how to forge a lasting peace agreement, looking at the causes of the war is not the only way to answer the question, but I think it's one valuable way to answer the question. I should say as well, right, that we can think about how this war might end by looking what's going on the battlefield. And of course, over the last week or so, what's been happening on the battlefield has largely been transformed by this incredible Ukrainian advance in the northeast, in Kharkiv Oblast. I'm not going to focus on that in this discussion, though I would be happy to take questions about how that shapes the prospects for peace. So the premise is to understand how we get to lasting peace. We need to understand the causes of war. And the big question then is not, again, just how we get to a ceasefire, but how do we get to a situation where Russia either doesn't want to attack Ukraine anymore, or it cannot attack because it doesn't have the capacity. So I'm asking the question in a far-reaching way, right? Not merely how do we stop war, but how do we get to lasting, secure peace? And I should say that I have that in mind, this distinction between lasting peace and temporary peace. There are lots of short-lived pieces in the conflicts that we've seen in the past. And perhaps here I should say as well that in my thinking about the Russia-Ukraine war, I always go back and forth thinking about this conflict as a specific, unique historical conflict, but also thinking about everything we've learned from all of history and from all the literature in political science about international conflict. So it's sort of a conversation between the general and the specific, or between the theoretical and the case we have right in front of us. And we know from history as well as from theory that there are a lot of pieces that don't last very long. The Minsk agreement, of course, of 2015 is really one of them. It never fully led to a complete ceasefire. And of course, in 2022, Russia completely ignored it and invaded Ukraine. We see these frozen conflicts around the region, whether it's in Moldova, or as we saw for a while in Georgia, or as we saw for a while between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And we see those things can become unfrozen. In particular, there's this problem pointed to in the international conflict literature called the commitment problem, which is that every peace agreement, especially these temporary ceasefires, are based on promises about what countries will do in the future. Right? We'll have a ceasefire now. We agree not to do that. You agree not to do that. The Minsk agreements had a lot of commitments by both sides. The problem is that in many cases, the states who make these commitments don't really have much incentive to follow through on them. We saw that with Minsk. And so when I talk about peace in this discussion, I'm thinking not merely about how we get back to a ceasefire that neither side is happy with, but how we get to a lasting peace. Or in other words, a peace that is not just a resting period until a new Russian invasion, or perhaps until Ukraine decides that it can seize some more territory back from Russia. So with that in mind, I've got a list here of basically the range of explanations. Why did Russia attack Ukraine? The first one is NATO expansion, right? It's NATO's fault. We've seen this, of course. This is the Russian explanation. We've seen this interestingly enough, from some people on the far left in Europe and North America, as well as on the far right. It's all the United States' fault for expanding NATO. There's another line that we hear particularly from Russia, but also from some Western scholars, that this is about Ukraine's oppression of its Russian-speaking minority. Then there's this, and I don't put a lot of weight in either of those explanations, but I just want to put them there because they're worth at least getting on the list. There's a lot more explanations from some very respectable scholars that this is about Russian domestic politics. The manifestation, of course, is an attack on Ukraine, but what this war is really about is Putin's effort to consolidate his regime at home, to defend it against possible threats, and to continue its kleptocratic ways. Scholars such as Michael McFaul, the former ambassador to Moscow, U.S. ambassador to Moscow, has articulated this perspective, as has the scholar Anders Osland, and Nina Khrushcheva has said something quite similar as well. Then there's another school of thought that looks down at Putin's individual characteristics, right? This is about Putin having lost the plot, to use an American colloquialism, or the word that often was used in the run-up to the outbreak of war in February was unhinged. Basically, the idea that Putin has become mentally unbalanced, either because of illness or because of his isolation during COVID, or because he has nobody around him anymore who can speak the truth to him. Or will speak the truth to him. So that perspective puts it very much in the nature of Putin as a leader in his way of ruling. A slightly different version of the one that focuses on NATO expansion is not about NATO expansion up to Ukrainians' borders, but about Russia's need to secure Ukrainian neutrality. And over the last several years, this argument would go with Ukraine interacting ever more deeply with NATO, largely, of course, because of Russian invasion in 2014. Putin and Russia decided they had to invade Ukraine to ensure that it remained neutral. The last explanation has to do with Russian expansionist goals, right? This idea that Russia simply insists in one way or another that it must control Ukraine. And whether we call that expansionism based on geopolitics or whether we call it imperialism, it amounts to much the same thing. And I've got a couple of subpoints there, sort of different versions of what Russia's aims are from an expansionist perspective. Putin and others have talked often about this idea of Novorossiya. Putin, in some speeches, talks about the tragedy of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that makes us think, well, maybe he wants to build Russia back to the Soviet borders of 1991. The speech he gave on the 21st of February this year really talked not about the Soviet Union admiringly, but very bitterly about the Soviet Union for the way that it had given away what he saw as Russian territories. And so that led a lot of people to speculate that what he really wants to do is get Russia back to the borders of the Russian Empire of 1914, which, as I think most of you know, but a lot of people in the West, don't have a clear focus on, went all the way west as far as Warsaw, but of course did not include much of Western Ukraine. So Novorossiya, Soviet Union, Russian Empire, I don't think anybody in Russia, Putin himself, has a very clear, defined sense of this is exactly where they want the border to be. And my sense is that's not what's important to them. What's really important to them is that they control Ukraine, right? And exactly where the western border of that will be is probably a matter of some debate among the Russian elite. So having laid out that large range of explanations for the war, I want to then talk about the implications they have for how we think about peace. And so basically, I've just crossed off the top two, and it's because the argument that this war was caused by NATO expansion, I don't think is plausible enough for us to spend a lot of time on it. It's worth mentioning, however, that, again, prior to the invasion in February, Putin stressed, or he laid out this draft treaty that sort of required NATO to go back to where it was in 1997. Nor do I think that the Ukrainian oppression of Russians is a valid explanation for the war, because I think, as we all know, there really wasn't Ukrainian oppression of Russians. There was a debate, like a lot of countries have, about language policy, but it certainly didn't amount to oppression of Russians. And as anybody who's followed Ukrainian politics knows, that for much of the last 30 years, parties based in Eastern Ukraine, led by Russophone Ukrainians, have governed Ukraine. And I'm thinking of the 8 years of Leonid Kuchma's administration, also the Yanukovych administration, and so on. These were not anti-Russian governments. So moving forward then to a shorter list of the things we need to think about in terms of peace. So if the source is in Russian domestic politics, Russian authoritarianism, then one way a lot of people think about peace is that we're not going to get peace until Russia is a democracy, a liberal democracy. And that taps into a much broader trend in scholarship known as the democratic peace theory. But I would point out that trend in scholarship, the democratic peace theory, has often been matched with a sort of the political leanings of the United States government, going all the way back to Woodrow Wilson, who in 1917, 1918 put forward the so-called 14 points. And essentially the idea was to make post-World War I Europe safe, because it would be a Europe of democracies. That refers back, but also move forward, right, to this broad idea that because democracies don't fight each other, a world of democracies is a safe world. And so the idea then is that Russian expansionism is closely bound up with Russian democracy. A democracy in this sense could not or would not be an empire, and so on. I personally, while I think Russian domestic politics are part of the explanation of this war, I don't think they're the big part of the explanation of this war. I think if it were hugely damaging to him domestically to fight this war, Putin might have been more hesitant. But what I think he saw was that domestically, he would probably get some credit for it. It would probably help him with some things. But I think the real motivation was more in the category of number 4, Russian expansionism. But nonetheless, there is this notion that if Russia becomes more democratic, this problem will be solved. And I would just say, from my perspective, I'm somewhat skeptical of that because I think there's a lot of evidence that a lot of people in Russia do support the war. And while there's an argument that democracies don't fight each other, there's a lot of people who think that argument has been overstretched, and that in fact a democratic Russia might be very supportive of a war in Ukraine. I live in a country that is widely regarded as democratic, but certainly has never hesitated to start wars around the world. The important distinction being, of course, in the democratic peace theory, people say, yes, democracies start wars, but not with other democracies. Whether that would continue to be true with a democratic but imperialist Russia, I think is worth debating. So the second explanation is about Putin's individual characteristics. And this is the sense of, again, it's Putin as a leader who resents the collapse of the Soviet Union, always resented the collapse of the Soviet Union, and has become then more isolated and perhaps less rational over time. And in this view, the solution of the problem is for Putin to be replaced as leader. And at least in the United States, but I think in the West more broadly, there has been hope for many, many years now, going back really 10 or 15 years. As soon as it became clear that Putin was authoritarian and was planning on sticking around for a long time, there was this idea really that has two parts. One is that Russia couldn't really change until Putin passed from the scene. And that's true probably in the sense that as long as Putin runs Russia, the chances for a dramatic transformation of its foreign policy are probably fairly narrow. It takes a much bigger step, though, to say that, and when Putin does leave the scene, Russia will automatically be transformed. In other words, that Putin is the only thing making Russia authoritarian and expansionist. And I personally am skeptical about that. And I'm skeptical about that for a couple of reasons, which I'll just try to summarize, and I go into them in gory detail in my book. The first is that Russia's dissatisfaction with Ukraine's independence predates Putin's rise to the presidency by really a decade, right? From the very moment of sort of the what was called the Parade of Sovereignties in 1990, a full year before the collapse of the Soviet Union, as Ukraine started talking about more autonomy and more sovereignty, right? There were nationalists and communists in Russia who often looked a lot alike, basically saying that they rejected this. In fact, it was the need to prevent Ukraine from getting more autonomy that largely spurred the putsch of August 1991 that led to the Soviet collapse. And from the very moment of the Soviet collapse, Russians across almost the entire spectrum said, well, this is all well and good. It's great to get rid of authoritarianism. It's great to get rid of the monopoly of the Communist Party. But Ukraine has got to be linked with us in one way or another. And it was only a very narrow slice of sort of radical reformers that didn't agree with that. And those people were out of power and sidelined fairly quickly within the first 2 or 3 years of the post-Soviet era. So just to summarize, in my reading of the history, this was not something, Russia's desire to regain Ukraine was not something that came along with Putin. It predated Putin, and it will probably last, therefore, after it. Moving on, the Russian need for Ukrainian neutrality. Well, that is something that Russia had talked about for a long time. But of course, it's equally the case that almost everything Russia has done, especially since 2014, has tended to push Ukraine away from neutrality. But even if we go back earlier than 2014, think about the process leading up to what was going to be the signature of the association agreement with the European Union in 2013. Before that, when Yanukovych is still president. What was basically on the cards at that point was NATO had basically put Ukraine on a very long future towards any discussion of membership. And in fact, if you go back even to the Bucharest summit in 2008, which everybody made such a big deal of, really at the Bucharest summit, it was the United States, it was the Bush administration, and Dick Cheney in particular, who was really pushing for Ukrainian membership, supported by some of the Eastern European members of the alliance. But Germany was dead set against it. France was dead set against it. Britain was still largely against it, and others. And so with the passing of the Bush administration, once Bush wasn't in power anymore, there was really no serious likelihood that NATO was going to, that Ukraine was going to become a member of NATO in any foreseeable future. So what was on the cards in 2013 was a closer linkage with the EU, but no relationship with NATO or serious relationship with NATO at all, or certainly not membership. And what we saw is that even that kind of relationship with the European Union was unacceptable to Russia. And it put immense pressure on Yanukovych to scuttle the agreement. And then, of course, when Yanukovych got pushed out, it invaded Ukraine. The point that I'm making is that Russia, despite what it says, its behavior shows that its goals in Ukraine are much more ambitious than Ukrainian neutrality. And certainly the way that it has waged this war has shown that it's after a lot more than Ukrainian neutrality. The last thing I would say about Ukrainian neutrality is even if that might have been a Russian goal before the war, it's more or less off the table because the only way Ukraine can conceive of its security in the future, of course, is whether it's formally a member of the NATO alliance or merely a huge recipient of military aid from the West. It's certainly not as a neutral country anymore. Okay, so then to move on, Russian expansion. And needless to say, if you've been following this, this is the explanation that I think explains the war. I think it's been, as I've said, I think it's been present since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. For a long time, Russia thought that it could get Ukraine back through Ukraine's own internal problems, pushing it back to Russia, or through some kind of pushing and pulling on the part of Russia, right? We'll cut off the gas. We'll stir up some separatist sentiment in Donbass or Crimea. We'll try to put some of our people who support us in various positions of power. And all of these things will try to leverage you back into a close relationship with us that we can then do more with in the future. It hasn't worked. And before I go further on this vein, that gets to an important point about the causes of the war. Many people would have argued that the war started because Putin was delusional, right? He was crazy. He completely misunderstood. And he did misunderstand something. He certainly misunderstood the ability and the commitment of Ukraine and Ukrainians to fight back. But of course, in that respect, Putin wasn't necessarily irrational because he thought exactly what all of the Western intelligence agencies thought. And he actually was, and actually a lot of Ukrainian leaders were saying more or less the same thing right up till the war, which is, boy, we may last only a few days if the West doesn't do something. I would argue that the decision to invade in 2022, while it might reflect a delusion about some things like the Ukrainian military, it actually reflects the end of a delusion on Putin's part. And the delusion that I think finally ended in 2019, 2020, 2021 was the delusion that Ukraine somehow could be cajoled or coerced into rejoining Russia. They thought that occupying some territory and imposing the Minsk agreements might do it. They thought that leverage would compel Ukraine to decentralize and to let Russia have this sort of fifth column in the Donbass. And what they saw over the 5 years, really, from 2015 to 2020, or from 2015 to 2021, was that Ukraine was not going to go for it. So, in other words, I would just say in the conclusion to the book that I published in 2019, I wrote that the only way that Russia was ever going to control Ukraine would be to conquer it, because the Ukrainians were never going to succumb any other way. And I fear that Putin read my book. I'm kidding, of course. But I think that was true. And I think Putin finally came to realize it was true, that the Ukrainians were not going to join Russia any other way than by simply being conquered. And that's where we get the current invasion from. So if that's the case, if Russia was determined to actually control Ukraine, and that expansionist goal explains its invasion, how do you get to peace from there? And so one argument, and there have been people in the West who've said this, right, is basically you appease Russia. That if you want peace in Europe, what you really have to do is let Russia have what it wants. And prominent American political scientists such as John Mearsheimer, as well as people further on the left, the late Stephen Cohen and others, have basically said the only way there can be peace in Europe is for Russia to be satisfied. And the way for Russia to be satisfied is for it to take Ukraine. And there's an element of realism in this, which is to say, it's tough luck if you're Ukraine. The famous line from Thucydides is that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. And the argument was, well, it's too bad for Ukraine, but the only way we're going to have peace in Europe is for Russia to be satisfied. That sounds realist. I actually argue that that's based on a quite powerful delusion, namely the delusion that if Russia is allowed to take over Ukraine, it will suddenly become a satisfied, happy country, and everybody can go back to business as usual. There's also, of course, a huge moral and ethical question and an international legal question over the acceptability of letting a big country just swallow up a not quite so big country. So one solution, if it's about Russian expansion, is to let Russia expand until it's happy. The other solution, of course, is not to make Russia happy, but simply push back hard enough against Russia so it can't expand even though it's trying to. And that's that second bullet point that says defeat and contain Russia. Russia needs to be defeated at least to the extent where it can't take any more territory, or ideally, of course, to the extent that it's forced to give back the territory that it's already taken, and then it needs to be contained. And that, in a lot of respects, is well, I'll go back a step. That, in a lot of respects, is the important takeaway from this, from what I'm trying to say, is that unless Russia dramatically changes, becomes a liberal democracy of the Western sort, and that democracy makes it get rid of its imperial pretensions, unless Russia changes dramatically in a way that's hard to imagine right now, we're going to be containing Russia for many, many years to come. Either that, or Russia is going to, at some point, not too far down the road, right, reassert itself and attack somebody again. So let's talk first, before we get more into detail on that, the conditions for temporary peace. All you really need for temporary peace, and here again, I'm thinking of something like Minsk, is a territorial division that both sides feel like they can accept in the short term, and a desire to limit costs. And the reason we were able to get to the Minsk agreement in 2015 is that the Ukrainian forces were really being routed in such a way that Ukraine saw a real need to limit the damage and limit costs. And Russia, and I think this is very interesting in retrospect, Russia in 2015 clearly was not willing to do what it was willing to do in 2022. So one of the real interesting questions we need to think more about is exactly what changed between 2015, when Putin tried to keep that war very limited, to 2022, when it's become much less limited. But that provided at least a temporary basis for peace, right? The other way that you can get to a short-term peace is if both sides feel like, oh, if we can have a ceasefire for a little while, I can rearm, regain my energy better than the other side, so that when war starts up again, I can crush it. And in a way, that might explain the Minsk agreement as well, in the sense that Russia, while it may have been ready for the limited intervention of the summer of 2014, it did not have anywhere near the number of battalion tactical groups that it had in early 2022. It went from about 60 in 2015 or 2016 to something like 160 in 2022. So Russia might have felt like it wasn't ready to bear that cost, but Ukraine as well might have felt like, we're in bad shape right now, but if we're given a truce, right, we can build up our army and we'll be better able to fight this war in the future. And of course, that's what Ukraine did. But the point that I'm getting at is, if that's the kind of peace that you have, that kind of peace is always a preparation for the next war, or for a restarting of the same war. And one can imagine, especially if you go back to March, April, and some of the kinds of things that were being suggested by some of the leaders in Western Europe, but again, by some American ex-government officials and commentators, it was basically saying, the first thing we have to do as quickly as possible is get a ceasefire. And the demand for a ceasefire makes a lot of sense because it stops people from getting killed and from buildings getting blown up and the economy being destroyed and people elsewhere in the world starving because they can't get grain and so on. So these ceasefires are very well intended, but they don't necessarily produce long-term peace. And so let's move on then and talk about longer-term peace. So the conditions for a lasting peace. You've got to get to the point where where really one of two things happen. Either both sides say, you know what, we're satisfied with this new state of things, right? This works for us. I cite Henry Kissinger there, and I'm thinking here not of Kissinger, the diplomatist, Kissinger, the scholar, a book he wrote back in the 1950s, focused on this distinction between revolutionary and status quo states. And Kissinger's argument was, if all of the major powers are happy with the status quo, then you really have the basis for peace. But if at least one of the major powers is trying to overturn the status quo, or what he called a revolutionary state, then you don't have the basis for peace. And Kissinger's insight that he took into office with him in the Nixon administration was that the Soviet Union had been a revolutionary power for most of its existence, but that by the 1970s, it was becoming more of a status quo state. And so that became sort of the basis for the détente policy of the Nixon administration. If we frame the problem in those terms, it's what would it take for Russia to become a status quo state, right? And if Russia can't become a status quo state, can't become happy with the borders that it was left in 1991, then the only other alternative is that it doesn't have enough power to revise the status quo. In other words, Ukraine and others potentially have to be able to defeat Russia on the battlefield, which of course, to some extent, Ukraine is doing now, although Ukraine has lost a great deal of territory in getting to this point. So one of the things to ask about the future is, what happens if Ukraine is dissatisfied with the settlement? What happens if Russia is dissatisfied with the settlement? And the assumption is that if Ukraine is dissatisfied with the settlement, well, that's okay because Ukraine can't do anything about it. Ukraine can't attack Russia. Russia's way more powerful. But if Russia's dissatisfied with the settlement, you need a lot of military power built up against it in order to stop it. So if we focus on what to do if Russia is dissatisfied, right, it makes you think about a peace agreement. Number one, you want to push down Russia's level of dissatisfaction. And number two, you want to push up Ukraine's ability to resist in the future. And so there's this strange kind of paradox where, and I think a lot of this talk is probably going on behind the scenes between Western allies and Ukraine, is as Ukraine is asked maybe at some point in the future to sign on to a peace agreement that does not recover all of the borders back to 1991, Ukraine, on the flip side, is going to be demanding more and more support to protect it against what Russia might do in the future. But of course, the further Ukraine pushes back against Russia, maybe you would argue the more interest Russia would have in trying to revise that in the future. But I also want to bring up the first part of this. What happens if Ukraine is dissatisfied with the settlement? Because as we've seen in the last week, Ukraine can revise things on the battlefield in a way that maybe a lot of people didn't recognize. And so you get to a potentially really tricky problem for NATO and for Russia, which is, let's assume for the sake of argument that we get some kind of peace agreement in this war, but Russia is still Russia. So in order to protect Ukraine in the future from a new attack, NATO is going to, or basically NATO, Western allies in general, are going to have to supply Ukraine with a lot of military hardware and with a lot of training. And Ukraine itself is going to have to devote a large part of its economy and, of course, its personnel to building a much larger standing army than it had in the past. And it's going to have to spend money on technology and so on. So what happens if you end up with a peace agreement that still leaves Russia in control of some Ukrainian territory, but now you have a very powerful Ukrainian military, right? Is there a chance that at some point in the future, the Ukrainians think, especially if there's some kind of disorder in Russia or chaos or a change of power, or the Russian military continues to collapse the way it's been collapsing, what danger is there that the Ukrainians will then launch a war that the Western allies don't want it to launch, and that actually Russia finds very dangerous? So there's then a dilemma in exactly how much military support the West gives to Ukraine. Hopefully enough to deter Russia, but not enough so that Ukraine is not deterred from attacking Russia. And the reason I bring this up is because it gets down to the crucial issue of NATO membership for Ukraine. And the paradox is this, is that if Ukraine is going to become is going to have a very powerful army with advanced hardware, lots of men and women under arms and so on, it's actually probably safer for NATO and safer for Russia if Ukraine is included in NATO. Because a Ukraine that's bound into NATO and can be constrained by NATO is probably safer from a Russian perspective than a Ukraine that just has tons of weapons and is dissatisfied with the status quo and is waiting for an opportunity to go back and get that territory back, sort of the way that Azerbaijan waited for 20 years till it saw an opportunity to take territory back from Armenia, even though Armenia is a Russian ally. So this is a dilemma that I think we're going to talk about going forward. I saw that there was just a paper released quite just in the last few days, right, jointly from a former NATO Secretary General and from the Ukrainian government, sort of laying out options for Ukraine's security in the future that didn't include NATO membership. And I think it's a very shrewd thing to be thinking about because, you know, any NATO member can veto Ukraine's membership. And so the question then is, what does a support program look like that doesn't include NATO membership? And I think that is very likely the conversation that we're going to be having. I think actually everybody would be safer if a big rearmament program for Ukraine is accompanied by NATO membership rather than is apart from it, because you don't know what will happen in the future. But that's just my opinion. Let me try to wind up here because I know we're out of time. So conclusions. I think this war is likely to end with neither side fully satisfied. And what I mean by that is, while it's still not entirely clear what Russia hopes to get out of this war, it seems pretty clear that it's going to get a lot less than that. I think it's also fairly likely that the war is going to end without Ukraine regaining Crimea. I know that might upset some people, and I hope that I'm wrong. But as a military prospect, right, crossing the isthmus and getting into Crimea is going to be a very tricky thing to do. So peace, therefore, the result is probably this war ends with both sides still dissatisfied with the territorial division between them. That's the key point. Both sides are going to end up dissatisfied. And what that means is that peace is going to rely on deterrence. And the big question then is, what's the best way that Russia can be deterred in the long term, while at the same time not getting Ukraine so powerful that it decides by itself that it's going to launch a new war to recover lost territories. And so the big, and I'm afraid pessimistic conclusion is that until Russia fundamentally changes, peace in Europe is going to depend on deterrence, either through retaliation, right? The sort of thing where you say, we're going to bomb Moscow if you bomb Kiev, or through denial, which is really what Ukraine's been doing over the last 6 months, which is saying your attacks simply aren't going to succeed on the ground. So I think that's the situation. And obviously the focus right now is on winning the war on the battlefield. But a lot of other people, of course, are already charged with thinking about what happens afterwards. And I think this last point has to be foremost in our minds, that, you know, the Cold War lasted from 1945, 46, all the way up till 1989 or 90 or 91, depending on how you count it. We need to be thinking about a post-war strategy that might last decades, because we simply can't predict when it is that Russia is going to become a country that is satisfied with its own borders. I think I'll stop there, and I think I can turn the slides off, and I'll wait to hear what Maxime has to say, and then I'll be happy to take your questions and comments.
Yeah, thank you very much, Paul. Before passing the word to Maxime for his comments and questions to you, I actually want to encourage everyone who is listening to us and watching us to post your comments and questions. Please do. We will have time for that. So please, Maxime, now your comments, probably questions.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Paul. So I have my timer for my 10 minutes to commenting, and I would like to go as follows. I would provide us all and the audience with 3 different quotes, and I would like to provide 2 quotes from Paul's book, which Paul mentioned, and then 1 quote from another book. So before I start my commenting session, a couple of questions, I would like to quote the thing from the book by Eugene Meehan, an old one, which is called Explanation in Social Science System Paradigm, which is a wonderful book. And because when Paul presented the causes for war, I also thought about how we can distinguish between the causes and the explanations. And this is what Paul did very good in his presentation, saying that this is what Russian propaganda basically, and this is the explanation that unfortunately some scholars, or what we would call by Russian stigma intelligentsia in the West, both from the left and from the right sides, are buying in. But the definition of explanation by Eugene Meehan is a very nice one. It says that explanation, I quote, must provide understanding of the past, generate expectations relevant to the future, and this is what Paul also presented in the conclusions, and suggest ways in which we can, in principle, intervene to alter or control events. So this is basically, if we do really understand the real causes, not the Russian propaganda explanations of why it wants Ukraine to be some sort of neutral, and this is also what Paul elaborated a lot of, we can really be able to generate expectations relevant to the future. And this is important, who is satisfied and who is dissatisfied with the peace agreement reached between Russia and Ukraine, also in Ukraine and in the West. And also, if we, in principle, I quote, can intervene to alter control events in the future. Okay, so I would like to take that definition of explanation to comment on what also Paul said. And I would like to provide 2 other quotes. One is very straightforward, another one is not that much straightforward, from Paul's book, which Paul demonstrated, and I like that you said that you would like to update it. So I would like to provide 2 quotes from the conclusion section. One is from the final conclusions of the chapter 8, and another, the first paragraph of conclusion from the chapter 7. And I would like to quote it, saying that a conclusion goes like this: while disagreement over Ukraine's status had been growing for years within Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine, and between Russia and the West, few foresaw, even in the fall of 2013, that Ukraine would experience a revolution over the matter in early 2014. Similarly, even as protests in Kyiv reached a peak in February 2014, very few anticipated that Russia would seize Crimea and intervene in eastern Ukraine in support of separatist movements. That these events were so shocking suggests that until the moment it broke out, conflict was not inevitable. Okay, and I think this is, of course, it's up to Paul to decide how to change conclusions, how to rewrite the books, but we can really see, and this is what Paul also presented, how much we can say that this invasion of Russia into Ukraine, if that was inevitable, because my explanation would be that from what Paul presented, and there were a lot of comments on that, saying that Russia has its policy and politics neo-imperialist or even imperialist. This is how we can play with the words, which concepts use best the explanation, that it was really, there was no ways to like avoid Russian invasion, because for some sort there was a Russian idea, and this also Paul commented, saying that Russia wanted somehow to really not oppress Ukraine, but have Ukraine as a part of Russia. Even if other means did not work, that was the last resort that Russia wanted. Okay, but then I promised another. This is the final quote, and this is from the conclusion. I think this is really a good book, is up to date with its interesting. This is the chapter 8 conclusion, And the first paragraph with a lot of quotes: greeting acting Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk in Brussels in March 2014 as the annexation of Crimea was in progress, NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen said, "We clearly face the gravest threat to European security since the end of the Cold War. And this is not just about Ukraine. This crisis has serious implications for the security and stability of the Euro-Atlantic area as a whole, and your sovereignty, your independence, and your territorial integrity are key factors for stability and security in the region." I think this is exactly what NATO generals and many European leaders are still saying. Now, so much has significantly changed, which means that really the sovereignty of Ukraine and its importance for the security architecture and so the way we deter Russia from also attacking other countries is of high importance anyway. So I think this was a good conclusion where you can really do good forecasts and also probably interventions. And this is not about if this war was inevitable from the very beginning. I mean, the full-scale military invasion, which happened this year on the 24th of February. So this is also a good point, like for our speculations and thinking what could have been done to avoid this, if anything. I also like, and I would like to stress that you mentioned democratic peace theory, because I'm also keen on saying that in Ukraine we misuse a lot the German term Realpolitik. And from previous lecture, maybe you noticed that many of your colleagues and guests for this series of lectures use a lot of German concepts as well, like Gewohnheit last week and things like that. But anyway, we use a lot of Realpolitik, leaving out of sight Idealpolitik. And also very good that you mentioned the 14 points of Wilson. And maybe that is one of the reasons there are so many, both from the left and from the right political spectrum side, who are buying in Russian propaganda, saying that we can appease Russia and we can reach agreement with Russia and doing things that really we have this ideal world order in which Russia can be appeased and things like that. So this is also one point that we as Ukrainians have to understand how in the West this conflict is perceived. I also would like to provide you with your quote. You said that Putin is not the only thing that makes Russia undemocratic, and this is totally true. And if we say that if Putin dies this very moment, for example, okay, it's not that Russia is going to become democratic tomorrow. There are a lot of changes that need to be to take place in Russia, and School for Policy Analysis are working now on the security formats for Ukraine, and also we're trying to see what changes can happen to Russian to the nations that live within Russia and also oppressed. If they, like liberation, can provide a change for Russia, that you also mentioned on your last slide, that Russia needs to change in order to provide us all with so the great question is, what should happen to Russia that all its neighbors are satisfied and that we are appeased, but we're not afraid that Russia is going to attack? Yes, I agree with you. As you said, Russia's ambitions are much more than Ukraine's neutrality. I would say that Russia misuses the concept of neutrality because a country that has no military, that is very weak, cannot be neutral. It has to stick to some sort of bloc. And a country that is beyond any political blocs and not a member of them has to be as powerful military as, for example, Switzerland with its landscape and its military. So, and of course, the war started not because Putin was delusional, and this is very good that you mentioned that, because some say there's only Putin's army fighting Ukraine, something like that. And you said the delusion that ended was that Ukraine could be coerced somehow into joining Russia. And all the strategies, they seem not to be working. And Russia could only conquer Ukraine, as you said. I agree with this, because Ukrainians are not we're not going to succumb, as you said, this is true. So this is one of the illusions that Putin gets rid of, and also nowadays Russia. A good point that you raised is who is dissatisfied with the peace agreement. If Ukraine is dissatisfied with a smaller country compared to Russia, we have to deal with it, as you quote. So we have to suffer what we have to suffer. Not your quote, but anyway, okay, a famous Greek philosopher. But anyway, if Russia is dissatisfied, then this is a problem. And I think this is interesting that we need to project our understanding that a dissatisfied Russia is a Russia that is stripped of its imperial ambitions. And I think this is fair enough for many countries that are still trying to liberate themselves, and also nations within Russia that are trying to get more autonomy, or even maybe to be somehow have this, they have the right to become like full-fledged nations with their own sense of identity and what their own sense maybe also foreign policies. I like your quote, and I would like to take it from today's lecture, that everybody would be safer, and also Russia and Ukraine in the world, if Ukraine becomes a member of NATO. And you provided a really good explanation for that. because, as you said on your final slide, peace depends on deterrence, and both sides are going to be dissatisfied with the peace agreement as it is of now. But I would like to add my point to this. I think that, first of all, the Russian dissatisfaction lies in this very Russian notion of it being still an empire and not recognizing its imperial legacy and also negative consequences on this imperial worldview, and also the worldview that the countries, there is a periphery where Russia has to rule and impose its vision of foreign policy. Without that, changes in that even perception that are really, they are beyond Putin, of course, and this is the Russian ideology needs to be changes. There could be no satisfied Russia, really, and Russia needs to be deterred. And a good question that you raised is also how much West is going and willing to support us, that we are able to take back our land and also to deter Russia. And maybe this is a philosophical question, maybe that, domino effect, maybe that would also have an maybe indirect spillover effect on Russian society, that maybe something, a small sparkle will really lead to a chain of event. There are changes within Russia, so that Russia becomes a more democratic and open society, like post-imperial syndrome, and maybe then the world and also our region can be a safer place. So I have now BP, which means that my 10 minutes over, but Paul, it was my pleasure commenting on your lecture, very insightful. And of course, I wish you to have a good revised version of your book, and I will definitely read that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Paul, if you have any comes back and on Maxim comments, please.
Yeah, I would focus in on just one thing, because I assume there are others who want to ask, is this question of how inevitable was this war? Because it was easy to say that the war, what happened in 2014, was not inevitable because there were all of these unpredictable things that happened. Looking back from 22, and this was the biggest issue I had in revising the book, looking back from the middle of 2022, you sort of say, Russia sooner or later was going to do this, because Ukraine was not going to just give in. But that point itself is worth noting, which is one way that the war would have been prevented would have been if 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 15 or 20 or 25 years ago, if Ukraine had done what Russia wanted, right? And so I think to argue that the war was inevitable takes away Ukraine's agency and takes our attention away from the fact that Ukraine had a big range of options in 1991. Ukraine could have signed the very early version of the so-called 9+1 treaty way back in early 1991, and and the rest of history would have been different. It takes two to get there, and of course, just take one other example. Russia thought in 2004 that it had the fix put in. Yanukovych was going to be elected president, and it was going to control Ukraine through that. And the Ukrainians said no. Same thing again in 2014. They thought after the 2010 presidential election, they thought we've got this fixed, and so on. And so part of the responsibility of the war, and I say this in a positive way, is that the Ukrainians did not knuckle under, right? They did not say, okay, it's easier, it's cheaper, we don't want to deal with our problems, just send us cheap gas, and which really is what Belarus did, right? Belarus said, keep sending us the cheap gas and we'll be on your side. And so that if we think of this, of Russia doing this to Ukraine as inevitable, I think it takes our focus on, in fact, sort of the incredible transformation Ukraine has made since 1990. There's a lot more to be said about the question of inevitability as it relates to notions of causality and explanation. I'm not a philosopher of science, and I don't think our audience wants to hear a whole bunch of epistemology.
Yeah. We have some time for questions, and there is one from Anton Sitor.
Yes.
Thanks for the lecture. The question is, how do you assess the viability and prospects for the implementation of the draft Istanbul agreements, preliminary prepared in April 2022?
I think time has left those behind. They may have been viable in April, although in April, I'm not sure how viable they were then, to be honest with you. But they're clearly not viable until now. But explaining why it's a good question and looking at it helps us understand how difficult this is. Which was in April, things were Ukraine had this incredible resistance, but Russia still looked like it was gaining a lot of territory, and so the Russians. Putin sent these guys to Istanbul, but there was no sign that he had given them any real instructions or any real authority to negotiate any kind of concessions. Because from Russia's perspective, it was doing okay in the war. And at that time, Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, was basically saying, yeah, okay, we know we're not going to be, we know we can't join NATO. And if we could get back to the borders of February 2022, that would be considered victory. Well, then the Russian invasion bogged down, and all of a sudden, nobody in Ukraine, I shouldn't say nobody, but the opinion in Ukraine now quite clearly is that merely going back to the February 2022 borders is no longer enough. And so as long as the war is going on in such a way that one side or the other thinks it's quote unquote winning, that side will have very little incentive to negotiate a peace agreement.
Yeah, there is also another question, and that is, you mentioned that there is a possibility of peace agreement without Ukraine gaining back all its territories. Does that mean that you think that there is only a small probability that Ukraine will be able to return Crimea by fight?
The short answer is yes, but I want to then qualify that. So first of all, I'm not a military person. And I generally think that anybody who predicts how a war is going to go is somebody you shouldn't listen to. And actually, what's happened in the last week is a good example. Who of us would have said a week and a half ago that Ukraine was going to take back, 1,500 square kilometers of Kharkivshchina? We just didn't. I had no idea. And so yes, I mean, all you have to do is look at a map and think about trying to cross that little tiny isthmus. That, in theory, should be pretty easy for Russia to defend. On the other hand, if the Russian military collapses and runs away, or if there's political turmoil in Moscow, all kinds of interesting things could happen. So yes, I think it's a small probability, but stranger things have happened.
Yeah. Thank you. There is also another question by Andriy Zahorulko. The question is, I'd like to ask whether Western powers even have a chance of appeasing Russia, considering ever-growing demands, like how Russia behaves with the turbine for Nord Stream, for example.
Well, this is a great question, and Putin and the Russian leadership is betting yes, right? Their bet is that come January, February, people in Germany and elsewhere in Western Europe are going to be cold. And when they have to choose between being cold and supporting Ukraine, they'll want to be warm. I actually think Putin is wrong about that. I think he has underestimated the will of Western Europe. I think he's underestimated the ability of Western Europe and other countries around the world to adjust. And I think he's underestimated the fact that the more Europe suffers, the more it blames Russia, not Ukraine or NATO or anyone else. There will be people, right? We all know about the Hungarian government. There's going to be a new government in Italy, and that's a government that's, from what we can tell, the Italian right is completely divided, right? Between a sort of pro-European bunch and a pro-Putin bunch. So that's the next big strategic battle that has to be fought, is going to be sort of in the living rooms and factories of Western Europe come January. And I don't think that they are going to want to appease Russia. I think what Russia has done is in so many ways so abhorrent to most people in Western Europe that there's a lot of unity to stop that. And there's an understanding that if they don't stand up to Russia now, think it could be much worse. But again, predicting how these things turn out is dangerous.
Yeah. I want to ask if probably Maxim has some questions.
Sure.
Maybe like a short question and comment. Like I know it's very difficult to forecast anything, yes, but maybe like a good question that I have been constantly asked by many Ukrainian media is what should happen in Ukraine, and what point they think that Russia would be willing to have real peace negotiation, not like, because Russia claims that the only thing they want us to surrender, but what in your opinion is not about military situation, but what like worldwide, and what should happen or take place, that Russia is willing to negotiate a peace agreement outside of its, its box thinking, like within we're a great power, because I think still there is no understanding. In your opinion, what should happen apart from the military component, so that Russia would be willing to negotiate another sort of peace agreement that we're now talking about? In your opinion, like, I do understand this like wishful thinking, it's not going to happen tomorrow, but maybe you would have some suggestion or vision of what it might be.
Yeah, I'll say I'm not optimistic, because my sense of Putin is he's not the sort who gives up. He's not the sort who thinks that it's okay to lose, right? He believes in power and in strength and in winning, and so he's got a very big dilemma right now, which is he doesn't believe in losing. But he can't win without probably some sort of general mobilization. Now, I'm afraid that what he's going to do instead is really start sending lots of missiles into Ukrainian cities. I worry very, very much that if he can't win on the battlefield, he'll do what he's done the last few days and go after the civilian population of Ukraine. So that worries me. But you asked the question, what has to happen on the battlefield? I think we're seeing it in Kharkiv region, which is it's got to be a situation where Ukraine is not merely pushing Russian forces back, but where the Russian front is collapsing. And in particular, if there's an offensive that begins to dig back into the territories that were seized in 2014, into sort of the so-called DNR and LNR, that will be a huge loss of face for Putin. Crimea, of course, we've already talked about. If Ukraine can really begin putting pressure on Crimea, and sorry, I'm going to digress briefly. If Ukraine can retake Kherson, it retakes the water supply to Crimea. If Ukraine can begin through some long-range artillery to start bombing the bridge across the Azov Straits, then you've got another problem for Russia. So these things then will really begin to get not necessarily just Putin, but the Russian high command, the Russian leadership more generally, to saying, we've got to stop this. And we already see a little bit of this with the offensive in Kharkiv, which is people in the Russian leadership saying, this is not going well, we have to change something. And so the more Ukraine advances, the more it will begin to divide the Russian leadership. But it's going to happen on the battlefield, and it's not going to be just incremental gains. It's got to be a real danger and a humiliation. Putin does not want to be humiliated.
Yeah.
So that's what I think it's going to take.
Yeah, thank you. We also have another question from Anton Suslov. In your opinion, what are the top 3 internal preconditions for Russia to change its policy toward Ukraine if it will be unsatisfied with the results of this war?
This is a good question. It's a huge question. And Maxim, I think, actually started us on this discussion by talking about sort of Russia's, we use this phrase, I don't think you use this term, but it's imperial hangover. Russia, can Russia conceive of itself as a normal country? And if you think about, in England this week, they're dealing with this issue again, which is how do we think of England as not an empire? And for England, it was hard. For France, it was very hard. But in those two countries, England, of course, as an island, France also geographically disconnected from its empire, it was pretty easy to see the difference between, a British person and someone in India 10,000 miles away. I'm sorry, there's a truck outside my house.
No, it's all right.
In France, there was a Mediterranean Sea between France and Algeria. Where Russia ends and where not Russia begins is a very, very difficult question. And once you start asking it about Ukraine, they have to ask that question a lot of other places as well, because Russia, of course, we know it started off as Muscovy in the 1500s or 1400s and just kept on expanding. And so for Russia to figure out what is Russia is a difficult thing, not only on the map, but then also in the mindset of the people. Can we imagine Russia that's not a great power? So let me just give one other example. I'm just checking how we're doing on time. Do I have a minute? Yes. Russia, let's go back to Germany after World War II. Germany fought World War I because it was a rising power that wanted its place in the world recognized. And it was, of course, the German Empire. It was defeated in World War I. It came back, right, angry and dissatisfied about its defeat and about how it had been treated afterwards. And it fought World War II to create this even bigger, right, German Reich. After World War II, Germany wasn't merely defeated, right? Germany changed its conception of itself. And the key conception that Germany had was that the Germans recognized that German power was a threat to its neighbors. And that because this gets to the concept of the security dilemma, that because German power inherently threatened its neighbors were then always going to have to build a big military to get ready for Germany. So the Germans actually, after World War II, kept their military relatively small, let the Americans stay. The Americans had hundreds of thousands of troops in Germany for most of the Cold War period. And of course, decided never to get nuclear weapons because they understood how threatening it was to others, including, of course, to Russia. Russia has not yet gotten to this idea of recognizing that while it wants to be a great power, its great power threatens its neighbors, which in turn then causes dangers for Russia. And Russia actually likes the fact that its power threatens its neighbors. It likes the fact that people are scared of it. And until it gets over that, until it makes the leap that Germany made in 1945 or that Japan made in 1945, which was to say, we don't want to threaten our neighbors. We don't want our neighbors to be afraid of us. Their neighbors are going to be afraid. So what does it have to do? It probably has to dramatically scale down the size of its military. It has to have a real open conversation about its imperial past. Not just the Soviet past, by the way, not just the Holodomor, but about Russia's imperial past. And even under the best of circumstances, I think it will take decades.
Yeah, I want like a question probably in continuation for that thought, because you mentioned that it also means like changing how Russia thinks about itself. It's also about changing the mindset of people and how people think about themselves. And what I can see from a lot of polls and surveys and qualitative research over the years is actually that Russian people, or rather people in Russia, are rather happy with Russia being this huge power that threatens everyone, even if they do not support Putin, let's say. So this idea of Russia being a great country is very well received in Russia. And so the question arises here, is actually possible to change this mindset without the defeat of Russia, which Germany faced, for example?
I think that's an excellent question, and I do not know the answer. I'm trying to think, and maybe someone in our audience can think of a good example of a country that has really walked away from its imperial mission, so to speak, or identity without a substantial defeat. In a way, you could talk about France and Britain, but of course, France and Britain did not really give up their empires willingly. They gave up their empires, even though they weren't technically defeated in World War II. They were so badly weakened by World War II. Oh, I see Maxime's got his finger up.
Yeah, Maxime, please.
I think as an example, of course, but there was a defeat, of course, to Swedish Empire. But the Swedish history, the Stormaktstiden, well, the Stormakt is basically the big power, so the great power period. But I think the Swedish example shows that the population was also dissatisfied with being an empire. And for the Swedes, changing, and then the period that follows, and one of the periods in the Swedish history is called Frihetstiden. And this is like the freedom period. I think it's a good example. There was a huge defeat, Poltava, and this is also what went bad also for Ukraine. But the willingness of the Swedish society to change and not get rid of this imperial past, but maybe I think there was a huge insight of Sweden becoming one of the world's leading democratic countries and liberal and open society was, oh, please, we're so tired of being empire and being, in the constant quest for conquering countries. Just an example. But you are right, Paul. I think there was also a big defeat on the battlefield, but there was a readiness of the Swedish society to do something else than just conquer neighboring countries and imposing its imperial rule.
Yeah, that's interesting. I know too little about 18th century Sweden to really discuss it. I will say this, I live in the United States and I've spent most of my life in the United States. I asked, well, what would it, the United States throws its power around in the world, sometimes without thinking very hard about it and without a lot of self-awareness. Nobody in the United States thinks of the U.S. as an empire, but a lot of people outside the United States do. And I certainly think, the notion of American greatness or America as a great power or as the leading power in the world. Yeah, what would it take for Americans to want to think of this country just as it's just another country? I don't know the answer to that. And so but I'm trying to look through the lens of the United States and think, yes, this would be, I think, really hard for the average Russian, just as it would be really hard for the average American.
Just to speculate a bit, what you've been talking about with Maxime also made me think if it becomes obvious to the society in Russia that the front collapse, for example, or that there is some military problems, and it could become obvious, whether there could be probably problems for Putin and his, let's say, elites in Russia, although people would still support, this idea of Russian empire and great power. But what I'm actually getting back, that I can easily see the scenario where this collapse brings a change in leadership in Russia, but not necessarily the regime down, or the Russia the one that opposes Ukraine and Europe and the rest of the world.
Yeah, I agree with this completely. Again, back on this idea that everything will be solved if Putin would just die. There will be a competition for succession if Putin dies, and I think one of the ways that different people will try to win that succession battle is by being more nationalist than the next one. And so I can imagine things getting worse in Russia before they get better. I do think there was a brief opportunity for this in the early 1990s, that if Russia's first move towards democracy and the rule of law had turned out better for the average Russian, better economically, I think this it might have been easier to give up the empire. But of course, it was an economic disaster. And then there was this idea, of course, that it was the West's fault, that it was an economic disaster. And so it's not just that Russia will need to de-imperialize itself, but there needs to be a viable alternative, both as a form of government and as a form of national cohesion. What is it that binds people together across all of Russia, if not this idea of Great Russia? I don't know. And so, and one of the things that the United States does have is we have a very clear internal sense of who we are and what we're about, as much as it's fraying in the current moment. Does Russia have something of that apart from empire and victory in World War II? It's not clear that it does.
Yeah, yeah. We have to. Maxim is leaving now, and we still have a couple of minutes. I thank you, Maxim, for being with us. We still have a couple of minutes, and I actually want to get back to the question, to the point you've made that Putin doesn't like to lose, so he may end up pulling more missiles onto Ukrainian territories. But here comes back the big question about nuclear weapons. And whether Putin is, where it is viable that Putin will use nuclear tactic or strategic forces, let's say. What is your take on that? Because there is a lot of debates about that.
There is a lot of debate, and it's a good question. I think it's very unlikely, but of course, it's a small chance of something that is hugely catastrophic. And so even if the chances are very small, it would be so catastrophic that we have to pay attention. My belief, I've been saying this since February when this question has come up, and I still think this is probably true, that I think people have been hoping for a coup against Putin. I don't think that's very likely at all. But I do think if there's anything that might get some generals to say, okay, enough is enough, it would be Putin saying, okay, guys, go drop a thermonuclear device on Kiev or somewhere else. I also think that Russia has a lot of conventional weapons. If Russia wants to bomb Ukrainian cities, it's got a lot of weapons it can use before it gets around to the nuclear ones. I think there is reason to fear that if Russia is facing a massive battlefield defeat, that it might turn to nuclear weapons. But I don't think there is any viable way to incorporate that into Ukraine's strategy or the West strategy. We have no idea when he will or will not use them. So how do you use that to modify your behavior? I think Ukraine and the West simply have to push forward. As things start to get better, there should be negotiations. And those negotiations, if the war is going Ukraine's way, the negotiations should be, according to the fact that Ukraine is winning the war. Because I still think Russia would probably rather negotiate a bad peace than to start World War III.
There is to continue. There is an opinion that I've heard discussed this sometimes that in a case like that, a case of a defeat or a bad peace, Russia would build the curtain. Iron Curtain, a new one, and become kind of a North Korea, inside which you actually can tell your population that you won everything you wanted to win.
Yes.
But outside, it would be, well, what would be negotiated, or what would be the conditions, or whatever. So, do you think that is a reliable scenario, or viable?
I think this is a tough strategic question for the West and for Ukraine, which is there is an argument to be made that says if the war is going to end sooner rather than later, Putin and Russia have to be able to claim some kind of victory. And there's another perspective, kind of the conversation we were just having, that if we are to move forward in the future, Russia has to be defeated in order for it to kind of have the transformation that it needs to have, and for it not to be threatening Ukraine anymore. And so that's a big dilemma about strategy. I think it's likely that on the battlefield, as I said, I think it's likely that Russia will continue to control Crimea. And so maybe that will be enough somewhere in the future for Russia to say, well, we accomplished these goals. It's okay if we gave some of this territory back. But I do think that's one of the tough questions. Are you still there, Anna? I'm afraid you've lost me. Are you still there? Okay, goodbye. It's been a pleasure talking with everyone today. Thanks a lot for your questions and your comments. And hopefully next time we'll do this in person in Kiev. Bye.